Hello, everyone. Apologies for the slight delay, and thank you very much for joining us for this Messam Symposium. This event was conceived alongside an exhibition which is currently on show here where I am in Messam's London. And we've brought together an incredible group of artists from around the world, all of whom are in their own way, either through their subject matter or through their practice, thinking about landscape and our environment in new and exciting ways, and in many cases challenging our preconceptions of the genre of landscape. And we thought it would be fascinating to have an event which looks deeper into landscape painting and landscape art more generally, and thinking about contemporary landscape painting, and invite artists and curators to discuss the ways in which art and painting help us to understand and often even define our relationship with the natural world. And we're privileged to be joined by a fantastic group of speakers this morning, particularly the two that are coming from Australia, where it's very, very late. So we're very grateful. And a little later on, we'll hear from three artists who are part of the Messam's landscape exhibition, Cara Campbell, Jean Huang, and Michael Rainsford. And they'll be in conversation with Calvin Winner, who is the executive director of the Gainsborough House Museum in Suffolk. And he'll also be hopefully giving us an insight into Thomas Gainsborough, who's one of the most influential landscape painters in the history of the genre. But first, we'll hear from three speakers who, in their professional capacities, all promote the important connection between art and environment. First, Bradley Hammond, who's the director of the Orange Regional Gallery in New South Wales, Australia. Phoebe Cowdery, the director of the Corridor Project and the artist residency program that they run, also in Australia, and Johnny Messam, who's the founder and director of Messam's Org, who's put together this exhibition here in London. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. We're very grateful and can't wait to hear what you have to say. I'll stop talking now and hand over to our speakers. But if we have time after the first group of speakers have made their contribution, it would be great to ask them some questions that our audience have. So if everyone would like to please leave their questions for the speakers today in the Slido bar. There's a Q&A function, I believe, at the bottom of your screen. So please do leave any comments and questions you have there, and I'll be putting them to our contributors. So without further ado, I'll hand over first to you, Brad. Thank you for joining us. And perhaps you could start by introducing yourself properly and the Orange Regional Gallery, of which you are the head. Thank you very much. Oh, I think you're on mute, Brad.
Thank you, Wilfred, very much for the invitation, and also thank you to Johnny Messam and everyone at Messam's. The only downside of coming to you from Australia is that we can't see this wonderful exhibition, so it's nice to follow along from a distance. And I'd like to also just acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Wiradjuri country, so I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm talking to you from today. And when we look at the first image of the Orange Regional Gallery space, this is a new extension to our existing gallery, which we recently completed. And the current exhibition that you'll see there is an exhibition by Peter Godwin. So this gallery space is really designed to work with natural light. And so it's a great privilege to be talking with all of you and to celebrate essentially painting, which I feel really has a new lease of life, really, in dealing with the subject that we're currently talking about, and also with the rise of artificial intelligence. I think painting really has so much to offer, and there's great potential. So this space really is designed to celebrate painting. And what I'd like to do is to talk a little about some of the artworks that we have in our collection, that offer us perspectives or ways of looking at landscape and the environment. And then also to highlight some of the artists we've been featuring over the last few years in this space, and to offer essentially ways in which they're looking at or asking us to join them in looking at the landscape through the practice of painting. So I'd like to also look a little bit about how they're using the medium of painting to convey some of their insights into the landscape and the environment. We have a wonderful work in the collection by Emily Kangware, who's one of Australia's most significant painters. She passed away in 1996. There is a major survey coming to the Tate Gallery next year, I believe. So I really encourage everyone to see that if you have the opportunity. Emily, as she's affectionately known, is a remarkable artist who started painting in her late 70s. And in the 8 years that she continued to paint, she produced around 3,000 canvases, which is an average of about one a day. And all of them reference her connection to country in the most profound way. And there were significant chapters in this 8 years, and each one was a remarkable shift that was quite profound. What we're looking at here, when you see this really quite beautiful painting with the pinks and mauve colors, is a series that she did in the early to mid 90s, which she called her dump dump style. So while we're looking at this image in our traditional way, which is we have a top and a bottom to the image, actually this painting, and as a lot with many Aboriginal artists, the works were painted flat on the ground. So there's really multiple ways of looking at this image. We just choose to see it this way, but it does have many fascinating layers to the work. When we look at Emily's earlier works, there are root structures which run beneath this kind of dot layering. In this slightly later work, the root or the network is now buried under these loaded brush marks. And the focus really is here for her. I should say that I'm really not qualified to talk about this in great depth because the way that Emily approached painting, and indeed the way that many Aboriginal artists approach painting, is so all-encompassing and paradigm shifting if we're thinking about landscape painting, that I really just encourage all of you to see the exhibition, and there's a lot that unfolds from these paintings. But it's all of country, it's all of her experience. It relates to thousands of years of connected tradition. And so I think when we talk about emerging landscape painting as we face a climate challenge, I think it's also really worth reflecting on artists who've come before and their deep and lasting connection over many thousands of years. Although they're working here with contemporary media, acrylic, and so on, Emily's beginnings really started with ceremonial body painting much earlier in her life, and that is a practice that extends back a long, long way. And when we look at the next image from our collection by Mavis Ngalameta, we see a similar kind of immersion in the environment and in the landscape. Perhaps you can see in this image, there's towards the middle, just down and slightly to the right, there's a circle in the image. And next to it, you may be able to make out a figure standing next to that circle. What that circle is something called Yalgamunkan, which is a sacred site, which was the site of Mavis Ngalameta's adopted son. She had to have special permission to go to the site to gather the ochre from the Yalgamunkan, or the clay pan. This had to be done in the dry season because during the wet season it was a swamp. And then the the painting is actually made with the ochres that are gathered at this site, which is around the Kendall River area in the very far north of Queensland. So this painting, you'll see a range of yellow ochres through to red ochres and some black areas. And this is made by baking the same ochre to get the reds. So this material itself is hugely significant. It's, in some sense, we could understand it as a sacred substance that connects to a dreaming site of great significance. And I think it's fascinating that the material itself, the painting depicts in many ways the gathering of the material that then the painting is made about. But there's this connection to particular sites, which is fascinating. And also to get to this very remote site, Mavis would often take a helicopter or a boat. The landscape is then depicted as she flies over the landscape in these bands that she would see from the sky. Or if she's approaching on a boat, looking from the coastline, there are other sites where she would gather white ochres as well. So when we then see how this has influenced other artists like Elizabeth Cummings in the next image, Elizabeth is one of Australia's most celebrated and significant living painters. And here we see a journey that she took to Elcho Island, which was in many senses a restricted site. She had permission to travel there, and the painting is titled After the Wet at Elcho Island. The previous painting that we'd seen by Mavis was done by bringing together many memories of different sites and creating this vibrating image. With Elizabeth, there's a similar quality. So when she was traveling through Elcho Island, it had just rained, and she was driving up along the island and had seen all these ochre-colored puddles. She asked everyone to stop the car. She did some gouache paintings on the bonnet, and then all of these gouache paintings then fed into this really remarkable painting where we see multiple viewpoints and memories overlapping. And the longer you spend with this image, the more it unfolds and presents aspects of memory and things observed as well. So there's a beautiful immersion in the landscape and a combination of memory, careful observation, and abstraction. So these are all working together to create a sense of what it felt like to be there rather than how it looks, which is quite different to the next image in our collection of a burnt out landscape. So one of the seasonal factors of living in Australia that is quite extraordinary are the regular cycles of intense bushfires that often rage out of control. They seem to be more and more frequent, and artists have depicted fire in Australia for many years. But this particular painting is, as you can see, very hyperreal painting, and it's painted a few days after a fire, and you can see that the leaves have settled on the ground. We have a partnership project where we place works from our collection in the local hospital. And I was quite concerned about putting this painting in the hospital just because of its image of destruction. But thought it's still a very beautiful painting, and I installed it out of the hospital. And at one point I wanted to move the image. I had some concerns about where it was sitting in relation to the services at the hospital. And the staff in particular were really concerned about it being moved. And I said to them, I'm interested to hear what it is about this painting, because they didn't want it moved. And because I felt it was an image about destruction. And they said, well, this is a painting about resilience. And so I thought that was a beautiful shifting. So the context in which we're looking at an image like this, and it takes on new meaning in different circumstances, depending on the viewer's experience. Many people relate very well to this painting, I think, because of also how it's painting and this very measured approach, which in some sense is quite different to the following image, which also deals with fire by John R. Walker. So that's John R. Walker is not to be confused with John Walker, who I think many of you will be familiar with. John O. Walker is an Australian painter who walks extensively in the landscape, making many studies and sketches, and has traveled very widely in Australia. And he was an artist that we featured in a recent survey exhibition. In 2019, we had quite horrific bushfires that dumped pink and grey ash on the glaciers in New Zealand, 2,000 kilometers away. I'll come to that in a second. But this image is John R. Walker's depiction of a pyrocumulonimbus cloud, which is essentially a massive cloud created by a fire on the horizon. It's a beautiful small painting. It's one of those paintings that increases in power because of its small scale. It alludes to something highly destructive, but it's quite an intimate work. And this cloud, apparently at the base of that cloud were temperatures that were comparable to Hiroshima. So this devastated communities down the southeast coast of New South Wales, which is where John O. Walker, he lives nearby. And he's still very moved by the impact on the community, the wide-scale destruction, and but also the incredible courage and humanity that he witnessed. So when we look at the next image of his depiction of fire, which is an altogether different kind of painting to the image that we saw with David Rose's After the Fires, that very still image. Here we have a painter looking right into the heart of a raging inferno. The painting is a very large painting, so one kind of reads it with the body, and it's painted with this kind of intense, kind of fitful, broken, and intensive, urgent marks. So one almost has a sense of a kind of crackling that and the ferociousness of the fire when you see the painting. The painting actually was conceived when John O. Walker was talking to a fireman who had been right in the inferno and battling these devastating fires. And he painted it after what he saw as the fires in the firefighter's eyes. So his name was Matty H. And Matty was so affected by the fire that John expressed almost witnessing the fire through Matty, which I thought was such a wonderful kind of connection with someone who had been really risking his life to save others and their property. So this painting is really a really dynamic painting, but it's also a powerful tribute to firefighters such as Matty. And John O. Walker, I think, is someone who's really fascinating because of his willingness to look at the challenging and very confronting aspects of the Australian landscape, particularly looking at, for example, drought. And this painting of the dry dam was done in the millennial drought. Again, it's become a really iconic painting. And John went and looked into these gaping kind of wounds in the earth and created this very bleak painting. When I was out at the hospital, a farmer who was looking at this, he still had an IV drip attached, and he was walking through the hospital corridors. And he said, "I know nothing about art, but I know about this." It was a very powerful moment in terms of connecting with people who live on the land and experience its ferociousness. How am I going for time? All good? A couple more minutes. So in the following image, we then have Mandy Martin from our collection, who she unfortunately passed away just recently, but her work was really a fight against the destruction wrought by large industry. And here we have, just near Orange, we have Cadia Gold Mine, which is a massive open cut mine. And this is a very large painting made of, I think, 6 panels. And it's called the Four Riders, and you'll see four dump trucks, massive dump trucks on the top left, which relates to the four riders of the apocalypse. So this is a much more, I guess, bleak vision, but very beautifully painted using some of the materials gathered, I believe, from the mining site itself. And then quickly, just to move through, back to John R. Walker, I think this very beautiful painting of west of Vulcania, I think is one of those paintings which shows the incredible insight that can come from something so arid and desolate. So this to me really shows the power of painting to encourage us to look at what might seem like a bleak and uninteresting patch of ground. John O. Walker's focus is really brings this incredible painting to life with a very minimal composition and color palette. It's an extraordinary painting in flesh. Then another artist who's looking at the landscape and the environment, but in an altogether different way, is Anna Pollock, who draws very strongly on Chinese traditions and is very influenced by Chinese traditions in the use of the natural environment to create a kind of sense of stability, meditative calm, and spaciousness. So working with what in Chinese art is often referred to as the aesthetics of emptiness. And when we look through her work, looking at the next slide, for example, these are Mullet Creeks on the Hawkesbury River, where she lives on an island in Dangar Island. What we have there is a film still of from her extraordinary film Flux. We obviously don't have time to show it, but I'd like to invite everyone to visit her website to view her extraordinary animations made observing the surface of the river. And if we go along 2 slides, you'll see her at work in her studio, where she's working with paraffin wax and oil paint so that it never hardens or dries. And frame by frame, she draws back through this white paraffin paint through back to a black background. And the resulting 8-minute film is just of rain and the movement of water. It's very, very meditative. And Anna is deeply committed to environmental awareness and uses her art to invite people to draw closer to nature. But she did do a portrait of her friend R, and it's another animated portrait of a friend who is deeply affected by the environmental crisis. He died a couple of years ago, and Anna really made this kind of tribute to him. He was someone who was deeply affected by the destruction of the environment that he was witnessing. So it's a very powerful portrait of someone who is affected in that way. Probably should wrap up, so I will just, we could just go down a couple of slides to where we see Ewan MacLeod sitting on a rock on the Hopapa Tasman Glacier. At the beginning of last year, I was fortunate enough to accompany Ewan to the Hopapa Tasman Glacier in New Zealand. And we spent 6 extraordinary nights on the glacier that Ewan had visited since he was a teenager. He used to be a mountain climber, but now he goes back and really, in a sense, documents the effects that he's seeing of climate change on the glacier, and it's receding year by year. You can see from the next image, he really does immerse himself in this extraordinary environment. He highlights the power and the potency of this environment, but also the fragility of the environment. So there's a beautiful tension in his work that you can see a documentary that we filmed up there of him at work. If you look up Ewan MacLeod Flux, please do. You can see him at work, and he produces if we look through the next 4 slides or so, all of these images were produced up there on the ice. So we had to take everything up with us, and these extraordinary paintings done sometimes in very intense conditions. And you'll see there's a sense of unease and psychological intensity in his work, which is also his personal quality that he's projecting into the landscape, but then also using the landscape as a backdrop to this kind of psychological space where this figure often enters and has to navigate this very precarious world that is both threatening and fragile. And I think one of the last things is just to notice that sometimes even the figures take on the quality of the environmental elements. So you'll see ice and rock and cloud people in his extraordinary works on paper. And yes, I think I'll finish there. So thanks very much. That's a kind of snapshot of some of the artists we've been working with and their approach to the environmental conditions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Brad. That was absolutely fascinating. I have lots of questions, but I shall save them for a bit later. So I think now we'll move on to you, Phoebe. So just a reminder, Phoebe Cowdery, also joining us from Australia, is the director of the Corridor project and their extraordinary residency program, which I'm hoping you'll be able to tell us a bit more about and talk to some of the artists that you have been working with and how they're relating to landscape, the environment, and issues pertaining to them. So I'll hand straight over to you, Phoebe. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that. And Brad, so great to hear you review all those wonderful exhibitions you put on. It's such a wonderful gallery. If you ever make it to Australia, anybody, please go to Orange Regional Gallery because they're just wonderful in terms of how they curate their exhibitions. So I would also like to pay my respects to the Wiradjuri people where I live and work in the central west New South Wales. They're the people of the three rivers, the Womble, which is the Macquarie River, the Murrumbidgee, which is the Murrumbidgee, and the Billagolari, which is the Lachlan River, and that's where we're situated. If we can get the first slide up, I'll just tell you a bit about the Corridor project, and then we'll go through a series of 12 slides to give you a window into our world over here. So well, the first one's up. I assume the first, yeah, okay. The Corridor project is a not-for-profit, multidisciplinary arts and cultural organisation based on Wiradjuri country in the central west New South Wales. We were established in 2011 as an idea to explore the interconnection between arts, culture and the natural environment within a regional context. This concept was based on providing unique opportunities for artists and audiences to access contemporary arts and cultural experiences. We provide a stepping off point, which is really, really important, and you'll understand that later on when I go through the talk, for residency, education, cultural pursuits and or research where alternative methodologies can be explored and developed. We promote wellbeing and contemporary perspective through arts-led cross-cultural exchange, enriching dialogue between regional and metropolitan communities. So as I just said, we're situated alongside the Billagolari, very, very beautiful river. And we're at the very beginning of just under a dam, actually. If you're familiar with Sydney Harbour, it's 2.5 times the size of Sydney Harbour, a dam called Wyangla. So an incredible kind of source of water. We are directly underneath a huge dam at the very beginning of what's called the Mid-Lachlan. Our remote site includes restored shearers' quarters and a repurposed historic woolshed that are the architecture for artists to stay and to create in the landscape. We offer studio spaces, accommodation and equipment. So basically our program is really inspired by, the geomorphology of the land around us, by the striking granite strewn hills, river systems, expansive night skies, and habitat corridors of the surrounding landscape. We support artistic and cultural growth through artist and residency exhibitions, events, workshops, architectural design, professional development and skill training, and this training is usually mentored by leading educators and cultural advisors. So I think we will now move to the second shot. So that's an aerial of the Corridor project, as you can see. So now we're moving to the first of the artists. We've got 4 artists that I would like to see as case studies that I'm going to talk about tonight. and the relationships they have to land. And there'll be a few things that I'll cover during this talk. You know, obviously the sentience, the agency that both the artist and also the land brings to the work that they produce, the more than human, which we have many artists who talk to that when they're producing work. Materiality, quite often the artists are using natural elements, whether that be pigments, water, air, atmosphere, whatever, to help inform the work that they develop. Experimentation clearly is something, you know, that we find on most of the residencies is a huge force in not only moving through what they know in their practice, but kind of clicking into new ways of expression, which we, and of course they find incredibly stimulating, and it's so exciting when that occurs. Generally, we find this does occur when they've visited us on a durational residency. And what I mean by that is over sometimes many years and through the season. So they may say, I want to come back because there's something in winter that I really need to capture. So in terms of the climate, we go down to about, you know, -3, and we go up to about 45 degrees in summer. So there's a massive range in temperature, and that has a really big effect on how artists perform as well, and what, you know, what their interests are. So we're going to go to image 3 now. As you can see, that first image was of an artist called Thomas Phoebe, and he came to us with a project where we had a professional development. Can you hear me? Yeah. Is that better? Can you hear me? Yeah. So Thomas came to us along with numerous others for a professional development program that we were running, looking at, you know, looking at climatic effect. It was a group of multidisciplinary artists. He was a painter, and, you know, we thought he would really respond well to this environment. He was one of 5 artists that were selected for an exhibition that was curated up at Orange Regional Gallery by their gallery curator, Lucy Granger, called Material Measure. And so there's Thomas in Winchester with his canvases, and, you know, he just kind of dived into this incredible meditation. He had quite an amazing team with him, actually. He had writers and photographers, you know, documenting his work throughout the process. And what I would say to any artist, always make sure your work is documented well, because it is such a resource, not only to have for the, you know, funding, but also for a gallery. I can't stress that more. Anyway, next slide, which is image 4. So place, environment, climate. I've just, you know, basically discussed those elements, but you know, we live in a fairly remote and in Scots wild environment. So as I mentioned, we're on the river. We do have, you know, every single bit of, you know, the creepy crawlies of Australia. You know, spiders. We have, you know, beautiful birds of prey, to you know, just an enormous biodiversity of you know, plants and birds and what have you. But it's really, it's so oral where we are as well, in terms of what you're listening to, what you're reading, what you're feeling, and that all has a huge impact on the artist. The next artist we're going to get to, and I know that we're running out of time, so I'll be quick, I'm going to fly now, is Matt O'Brien. So he's an artist from the Northern Rivers, and I put a couple of images of Matt's here, which is image 5 and 6. This is Matt in situ at the corridor. He became really excited working with pigment. He's probably one of the most prolific and fastest and intuitive artists I've ever been around. He really is quite extraordinary in terms of how he reads the landscape, how he uses the landscape, to paint, you know, how he experiments with you know, different bonding agents and different materials. This is actually painted on Upo. This, you know, just that kind of plasticky, you know, material. But the effect is really fast paced, and I think that you know, definitely is a amazing kind of contributor to his practice. So the next slides we're going to get to is slide 7. Here we have Tiger Helm, as you would all know from Messens. Tiger came over to us earlier this year for an artist in residency in February, so it was hot. But when she arrived, what was really exciting was the way she read the landscape, attuned to the landscape, and changed her palette from, you know, probably an English palette, which she actually spoke of, to really understanding, you know, I think through atmosphere, the you know, that just changed her palette using white, which she's working up these drawings to take that for an exhibition back at Messens. But there's a beautiful video that Sammy Hawker made on Tiger while she was here, who is an Australian artist, I should say, who we come to next. We're on slide 9 now. This is a piece by an Australian artist called Sammy Hawker. She's a photomedia artist, and this piece is called Caterpillars in Metamorphosis. It's a chromatogram, and to me it is very painterly. But this was actually developed by white cedar moss that she found dead. She crushed up and made into a chromatogram, and then scanned and won a prize, the Photo Access Prize in Canberra for this work. And it was just a really extraordinary work. So I'm just looking at the chat. Okay. So the next image, which is image 10, this is Tiger when she arrived in Australia, and I introduced her to Sammy Hawker. Peer-to-peer exchange is absolutely fundamental for, you know, all artists to meet people not only across borders but also in their own country, and people with very different fields of practice. And these two just hit it off, and I think that's really reflected in the video that that Messens you know, commissioned. So that's when Tiger first arrived in Australia. I was picking her up from Sydney, and we're down in an area called Bronte, looking out to the sea. Okay, so the next slide, image 11. I realise I've only got another minute. This is a group of National Art School alumni with Tiger, who's in the centre, and our dog Atticus at the forefront, our beautiful little kelpie. This is Wangler Dam, which I was speaking of, which is just sits behind the corridor project. And this was just one of those magnificent days where it was raining. There were beautiful luffs, you know, on the water. And, you know, it was so atmospheric and so beautiful. And these guys, you know, kind of walked for an hour or two and really bonded. Those relationships cemented, and they all exchange, you know, communication between one another. They all have very different practices. A lot of them use organic material from the land to make inks, and they're all, most of them are represented in well-known galleries in Sydney. They're all kind of in their mid-20s. So it was just a great opportunity to kind of segue Tiger into the residency, and then she had time by herself near the end. And the last image I want to go to is wattle in one of our corridor in one of the corridors at the corridor project. So we have planted thousands and thousands of acacias and trees and plants over the years, and now we do have a thriving corridor of activity, as I said, with bird life. But that also is a wonderful place for artists to be, to think, to explore, to experiment, to engage with the more than human, cut off from the human. And we find that dual agency between nature and artists really profound. I know I haven't really gone into, you know, talking about climate in Australia. I think everybody understands climate around the planet is, you know, something that, you know, we all explore, we learn from each other as to what's happening in other countries through what we view on the television every night. But, you know, it is, we're all in a vulnerable state. And I do think artists have this extraordinary ability to communicate what that is in real time, but also in the past. And you know, certainly that will be more and more present in artists' expression, I think, in no matter what they're doing or what materials they're using, or, you know, or what their communication is, it's going to become even, you know, more present. Anyway, I think I'll leave it there, but thank you. And Johnny, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. Yeah, again, I have so many questions, but it's an incredible project, and it's wonderful to hear about it. We'll move before I start asking you questions. I would like to hear from our very own Johnny Messam, who's the founder and director of Messams.org, who put together this exhibition and whose idea this symposium was. And Johnny, I was just hoping, that you could talk to us about the work that we're doing at Messams, our program of active environmentalism, and where we're sort of moving to in the future as a gallery, working with artists to promote environmental issues.
Thanks, Wolf. It's slightly surreal to be on the panel of a conversation in the gallery, and I sort of wanted it to be in this way to sort of remind ourselves, or maybe remind myself, that is a project like this is a collaboration of minds, and that we sit, if you like, as a table of equals to think through and find solutions together. And most of what I see as the role of the gallery here is to be a platform for these discussions. And so the point of this conversation is to start us in the context of a building which is just behind me here. So I thought I would give those of you who are coming to us a background to the barn, if you like, to the history of the business, why we started out and what we learned along the way to arrive at where we are today. And the gallery was started in 2008 by me with a simple question to try and understand a little bit more about what art could do for us. And it struck me that in a building which is a 13th century barn, which is the largest surviving thatched building in the country, that this would be a good place to present art slightly differently. And in the course of that, we started a program of talks, which I called active environmentalism. And I suppose because I'm the age I am and the generation I am, that I didn't grow up with concerns about carbon footprint and oil. They were just there. And we knew a little bit about things like global warming, but it was present, but not a forefront of our mind. And what developed over time was a series of talks which we called active environmentalism, because I was interested in the dialogue that happened when we sat as a group and thought, rather than having environmental activism, which was a protest in a sense, is what could we do that was more of a collaborative venture? And so I turned it round and I said, well, look, this is something we need to participate in. This is a conversation that we want to have together. It's very, very different from the role of a gallery, really. The primary role of a gallery is to present works of art for sale. And if we're a good gallery, we're going to present works of art for sale with context. But I think we miss a point if we do that about the capability of art to be a language, that can share thoughts in a non-verbal way. And so this unrolled, if you like, a series of questions which continue to where we are today, providing a platform for artists to find the language which they can connect to an audience who want to know about environment. And the trouble is that when we started with a program called Active Environmentalism, we invited artists and we invited scientists on, and we began to find the knowledge, if you like, that was missing in areas of questioning. We had some fantastic talks about landscape, about hydrogen, carbon footprint, and all these bits. And you realize that one of the jobs that we can do is to provide a platform for science to meet with art. And so that's the program that we began to run. And the information that came from that in terms of the reality of our landscape dictated us to have to do something. I think it obligated us really to take a more active role. So the question, if you like, is what is a gallery for today? What are we looking to do when we put these shows on? And I wanted to see how we could ask a question with our artists of what are you seeing differently? What's changed in your mindset, and how have you responded to our current environment? Which is the basis for our open call and the basis for the artists that we selected in there. And it ended up being a much bigger platform than we thought. I think we had 400 people who applied. And we had 8 that we ended up choosing for the gallery as an exhibition. So one of the things that we looked at when we did this was how has the presentation of the landscape changed? And in the course of that, we looked at artists whose work had perhaps shifted from the normal landscape down into an awareness of the environment. And I think that show platforms that for us. As a gallery, we've got one space here in Wiltshire and a representative space in London where we can put on art, and we still have a responsibility to our artists to present works of art, and we have to think through how, if you like, the process of supporting artists buying works of art can sustain their practice and these principles. So we're interested in exploring the dialogue around materials, which artists are using different materials and how we can be aware, if you like, of the extractive nature of the materials we're using, and how those can be adapted, and how aesthetics, which is, I suppose, the basis on which we are drawn towards things, can be moved. And so that we can begin, if you like, to fall in love with different things. And so, if you like, I think the role of the gallery here is to provide access points into these conversations that have come from different areas. To be comfortable not knowing all of the answers, and therefore not feel like you have to provide them. And to evolve spaces, which is what we are doing here in Wiltshire, but it's what we're doing also in Lowestoft, up on the East Coast, which is a building that was formerly a post office. And I liked the idea when we were presented with this space, which had no precedent as an art space. We just were invited to think about what it could be. And I thought, in a way, that the post office and the metaphor of information that comes in and comes out was a perfect way to think about how a gallery might be. And so that this grand building, post offices were much vaunted in the 19th century. It was the backbone of the UK. Could be a place where information came in internationally, and where local information was sent out. So it was, if you like, a conduit. And so our job in that, I felt, was to be the place where people could come and stay, where that information could be shared by looking within the local community and by inviting people from further away to come and share. So very much in the same frame. And that, I think, is one of the roles of the gallery. And the reason why I'm so grateful to Brad and to Phoebe for being part of this conversation is because, for me, I think some of this process of understanding landscape is based on being more in tune with it. And it strikes me very clearly that what's going on in Australia with these two projects, with those artists who are working there, is a much more present sense of our rootedness within the landscape. And I like that thinking, perhaps, that we are, in a more holistic sense, caught up with it. And so that's the respect, if you like, I have for the artists who are working on the landscape in Australia, and the opportunity that is presented by being there, of being consciously aware of continual human presence and activation on that landscape in a period of time longer than ours. And then you look back here to the UK and you realize, well, that probably isn't ubiquitous. It's been happening for a long period of time. And I find then a story here in Wiltshire about a piece of coral which has been carried by a human being 400,000 years ago to Swanscombe in Kent, off of what was at that stage a coral reef. And so you realize this is the earliest example of what would be called a manuport, or a object that has been carried by one place to another with no discernible functional purpose. If you like, it is a proto-art piece. If you assume that art's purpose is to find you a connection, a sort of contextual connection to landscape, environment, and to your fellow human beings. So you realize that this is very much caught up in our own way of thinking about how we connect to each other. And that it probably is much more constant than we've gone before. And then, so that struck me as a very powerful underscore to the purposes of why we have these artworks being made. And the purpose of a gallery to promote that understanding within the wider audience. And it's quite a tricky role. I'm not going to shorten it because we have spent the large part of the 200 years or so mechanizing and commodifying pretty much everything in the world, for good reasons. But perhaps in the context of art, we've missed some of the main reasons why it's been made. And I think it's our job, perhaps, to provide a platform for those conversations to adapt and to change about why and what art can be. So that's us, if you like. The gallery side of the three people here today helping to support landscape painting.
Thank you very much. Well, yeah, we've heard from three different sectors, really, as you say, who are helping to support landscape painting. And we have lots of questions that have come in from our online audience. Sticking with you for a second, Johnny, but actually, I'd like to throw this out to all of you as well. Someone's asked, a number of artists in the Messams shows use untraditional materials, some of which are impermanent and attempt to capture the precarity of our environmental position. Could you share your thoughts on how this type of work might be accommodated in shows and collections? So sort of unusual and ephemeral materials and how that sort of fits with objects of permanence and that we sort of root ideas to.
Definitely. again, a shift of aesthetics. We have to be comfortable with time, I would suggest, and our relationship with objects within that, to find connections with things which are every bit as good because they don't last, rather than because they do. We're hosting a sculptural platform in Lowestoft in June 21 next year, and one of the posts there will be for working with materials which have got ephemerality in them, and we're actually hosting an open call. So if anybody's interested in being part of that, it'll be a one-off installation that will be previewed here in Wiltshire and then presented on the beach there. And the idea is to really look and say it's okay. Our job is to make people comfortable with things that don't last, and still find reasons to buy and spend money on them. So it's a big challenge, and that's given my role. But I think the way into it is to think about aesthetics and beauty, and to think about time as well as to what you're buying.
Thank you. Brad and Phoebe, do you have anything to add about sort of new materials and impermanence and the importance of exploring that?
Sorry. Well, just in answer to that, when Johnny was talking, I just wrote something down, just a question to myself: what is permanence if our resources are finite? And, it gets back to that question. We all know mining is enormous. There are huge conflicts with all sorts of people why we need to mine certain minerals, particularly when there are solutions areas, like renewables, for instance, so coal. And, I'm hearing you, Johnny. I think it's incredibly audacious, very, very exciting that you have a vision for artists, that artists should be maybe changing the way that they have been taught about materiality and really question because we are the biggest polluters, artists. We all know it. Like, there is so much weight of what it is that we produce to kind of get that great work that can be shown in the gallery. And also, to be truthful about this, there's a lot of ego wrapped up in that as well. In terms of what type of material. I studied formalism at art school, the National Art School, 100 years ago. And sculpture, art sculpture, with bronze and, all the heroic materials, it was very patriarchal. And I was talking to Johnny about it the other day. I just said, it kind of froze me from producing work when I left, because I felt, why do I want to produce something which is going to outlast me forever? And look, there are so many brilliant bronze, sculptors. My gosh, Lawrence Edwards is extraordinary, and there are so many brilliant ones in history. But I, for myself, had an uneasiness about it a very long time ago, just for myself. Not that I don't respect other people, of course, but yeah, I'll just probably leave it there. But interesting, good question, really good question.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Perhaps we could move on to another question. I just wanted to ask, starting maybe with you, Brad. You began by, in fact, so did you, Phoebe, actually. You both began by acknowledging the original ownership of the land on which your respective institutions now stand. And I was just wanting to hear from you all really about what is the importance, do you think, of the human heritage associated with landscape, and how does that relate to the art that's produced in response to it?
I think the first thing with that is that it really is a reminder of the incredible length of time that people have been on these sites, and even the notion of a gallery, and it's very recent phenomena, really. So it's a great reminder of I think just the short moment that, and the privilege that we have really to be on this land, and it's unceded land as well. So I think it's acknowledging that it's political, and there are open wounds that really will only heal when there's a shared history, and we've a long way to go. But I think it's important to continually acknowledge that and be reminded of it, so that we can work towards that shared history. And then I think it also points back to what Johnny was referring to there with the transience of things. To, you know, there's a very much with the way the market works, and traditional museum and gallery structures is striving for some kind of permanence. This new aesthetic, I think, will be around seeing the transience of things and embracing that, and not seeing it as some kind of failure, that things pass. So I think seeing our role as just a moment in a much broader timescale and paying respect to those long traditions is, yeah, I think it's essential, really. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if anyone else has anything to add on that, or should we move on to another question from the audience? So someone else has asked, what role does the art community have to promote sustainability? I know, Brad, you talked about the artist who was responding to the ash that had fallen on Antarctic glaciers, and sort of raising awareness of that. And Phoebe, you spoke just in fact now about the fact that the arts are actually an enormous polluter. I don't know if one of you would perhaps like to talk about art and sustainability and the role that the community has.
I could probably just reflect on, you know, a couple of things I was talking about with some of the artists who stay with us on residency. I do see a huge shift happening, but I don't know whether it's just because they're attracted to, you know, to natural environments, that is a type of person that will come to us. You know, I doubt a resin artist, for instance, would be stimulated by our environment. Maybe they are, you know, but you know, so there's already an embedded awareness, I think, when people come to us, just because the nature of what we are, what they've seen online, and they resonate with it. But, you know, they're the audiences that we would love to get, particularly, you know, when we talk about environmentalism, we run a project, we work a lot with scientists too, and for National Science Week this year in August, we run a project, a 2-day event called Earthworks. And, you know, it was really great because there were people there who were not from the arts, who were not even scientists, just, you know, your everyday person from our local towns. And I think, you know, the nudge of these conversations, doing it in a way where it doesn't feel like it's being kind of rammed at you, but it's done with a sensitivity, and these artists can elicit that voice where it doesn't feel threatening, but it's another way of perception, particularly with the installation works that we had, which were really well documented post the event. I think, you know, that will definitely register with other audiences. It's those other audiences that I'm interested in. You know, I mean, you know, we know who's going to come to our events, but also the ones that are conflicted, because we are in a very conservative time, and in our area there are people who believe X, Y, Z, but, you know, and I'm interested in what they have to say and bringing them into the conversation with them. So there's conflict in that, just understanding different points of view. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I just wanted to ask one more question, which was, I mean, so again, going from sort of what Brad was talking about in his talk, but it's something that you've all touched upon, is that a lot of the artists that you're working with are almost interpreting landscape through human experience. The reason I mentioned you, Brad, is because you talked about the looking at the perspective of someone fighting the fires that were being depicted in the work. And I was wondering, do you think this is something that is happening more and more, is that we're looking at landscape in relation to human experience and thinking about the way that we interact with the land, as opposed to sort of looking at it perhaps as an object of sublime beauty in its own right? Or is this something that is not new, but is just seeming to come in more explicit ways? Or yeah, what are your thoughts?
I think it's not new, but we're becoming aware of the fact that we are always participating in our reading of landscape. I think there's when you look at John O. Walker's work that I mentioned, or Anna Pollock, Ewan MacLeod, in fact, any of them, there's an awareness that we can only ever experience it with our consciousness, and that we're always participating. That it's very hard to talk of places or landscapes without psychological involvement, and so I think we can't escape that. And this capturing of the quality of the sense of being in places rather than objective analysis, I think, is what makes it humanizing and what connects us. This sense that we're standing alongside someone and seeing it through their experience or their feeling. This also connects us across cultures, language barriers. It really is something that I think unites us. It's the great power of painting, for one thing, is, you know, we can look at images from other times, other cultures, and find points of connection. For me, this really relates very closely to Hans-Georg Gadamer's approach to aesthetics, where really we're always participating in the making of meaning. You know, the artist works in one sense, we bring our consciousness to it and all that we experience and the situations of the day or the context, and together we make new meaning. And we're always at that horizon where what he called a fusion of horizons. We're all participating in making meaning as we go. So it's not that people think of that consciously, but I do feel there's more and more an embrace of audiences and the respect of the audience as a participant. And I think when that happens, then exciting things start to happen. Particularly also allowing children to have space creatively in these traditional institutions. They offer such extraordinary perspectives that show us fresh ways. I'll give you one very quick example that I loved of an 8-year-old who told us at the gallery that art is what ideas and feelings look like. And I just thought that was such a brilliant description, and I use it all the time. You know, and I think it was great to have that 8-year-old remind me that you know, it's such a simple, beautiful definition, but really, I use that when, you know, we have people visit the gallery who feel perhaps they don't understand the work, and when they hear that, they feel they then have permission to enter into the conversation. So yes, I think that we work hard to welcome and make art accessible for everyone, rather than people who feel that they have secret knowledge, but that it and that in that meeting is something new is created.
That's wonderful. Yeah, and that's such a great reminder. I think we'll have to unfortunately wrap up the conversation there, as we're running out of time and need to move on. But thank you, all of you, so much for your contributions, and it's wonderful to hear about the work that you're doing. So now we will move on to introduce Calvin Winner, who is an art historian and the executive director of the Gainsborough House Museum in Suffolk, in Sudbury in Suffolk. And Calvin, I hope you are going to tell us more about landscape, thinking about perhaps in more of a historic or historical context, and give us an insight into Thomas Gainsborough, who is an artist that you know very, very well.
Thanks, Will. Yeah. Thanks for that introduction. Can everybody hear me? Am I getting thumbs up? Good. Sound is good. Do let me know if it fades out or anything. So thank you for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here. As Wilf said, I'm the director of Gainsborough's House, and what I'm going to be talking to you about today, I'll give an introduction to Gainsborough's House, the work of Gainsborough's House, and then a little bit about historic painter Thomas Gainsborough, and then I thought I would focus on one particular painting just to speak about for a few minutes, and that painting is Cornard Wood. So hopefully in due course we can put a slide up of that so that you can see if you don't know that work already. Great, that's brilliant. And then to sort of wrap up my my part of the event, just a sort of introduction to how we are proposing to program in the forthcoming seasons, and developing a program around art and landscape. So, but I'll start with Gainsborough's House. Just give you a little bit of a sense of what it is, if you don't know. So it's a public art gallery. It's based, as Wilf said, in a market town called Sudbury, in the region of East Anglia. It's about 60 miles from central London, so it's relatively close to the metropolitan area, but it actually remains relatively rural. If you think about the sort of UK context, you can have very large cities and relatively rural areas quite close to the metropolis. So that's worth bearing in mind in thinking about the approach historically to landscape, but also the contemporary. And we should remind ourselves that it's part of an agricultural region based mainly now around arable farming. And that's the kind of, just a sort of a sense to set the scene of what or where Gainsborough's House is. So, I can see we've got a slide up now. So you get a sense of the building. So what you're looking at there is the childhood home of Thomas Gainsborough, and this so you know it's an artist's home. He spent his formative years there, and to give a sense of Thomas Gainsborough's gravitas, you know, he is one of the sort of great trinity of historic British artists. So Thomas Gainsborough, John Constable, and J.M.W. Turner. So there's this great sort of trinity of historic painters. The family home is 18th century building, built in the 1720s. It's actually a bit of a makeover because it had been two earlier cottages joined together, and what you see now is this sort of 18th century townhouse. But that was really established by Gainsborough's family, who were master weavers, and during Gainsborough's childhood, they expanded their business, and you know, what now looks like a sort of domestic house. Indeed, it was domestic. Gainsborough referred to it as the mill, because in fact it was the centre of manufacturing as well. So this is a cottage industry or a townhouse industry in a sense before the industrial period. So this building was in fact full of looms in Gainsborough's childhood. Again, just to give a sort of wider context, in Gainsborough's time, the 18th century, the region, as well as it was concerned with arable farming at that time, but the great sort of money-making enterprise was wool. So it was sheep farming was really important in the region of East Anglia, and indeed there are many towns, including the one we're based in here, Sudbury, which was formed and based on the wealth of wool. So, so in terms of Thomas Gainsborough and his family home, an artist home, but in fact by the 19th century the house had been sold. Don't have time today to go into all that history, but it was always known as Thomas Gainsborough's family home, and indeed come the mid-20th century the property was up for sale, and there was a strong sort of local regional concern that it should become a museum. So in fact it was bought with that in mind in 1958 and opened as a museum in 1961. And from that sort of foundation, there was a sense that it was an institution that would celebrate Thomas Gainsborough but promote knowledge and appreciation of this great artist. And in fact, since that beginning, when, if you can imagine, there was no art collection here, there was not even a sense that any of the original furnishings were part of the house. It's developed over that period so that now we have the biggest collection in the world of works by Thomas Gainsborough, and the house itself is laid out in kind of themes, room by room, looking at different aspects of Thomas Gainsborough's life and work. In recent times, that original sort of context has been expanded so that we now have a new building that was created a couple of years ago, finished a couple of years ago, where we can stage significant temporary exhibitions and sort of run a program of exhibitions alongside the house and our presentation of Thomas Gainsborough. So that's a sort of transformative project. And I should also just say that on site we also have a printmaking studio where we have members who are able to practice on site, develop their practice, and also we offer that also as a sort of learning resource. So we do workshops and activity, or at least our printmakers are involved in doing activity and workshops and disseminating information about printmaking. So I'll leave it there in terms of what Gainsborough's house is, and then we'll move on just a little bit of further context about Thomas Gainsborough. So born in 1727, died in 1788, and in the sort of British context, he's seen very much as an originator of British landscape painting, and at that point, landscape painting really developed in the Netherlands and the Dutch tradition of who really sort of saw this as a new emerging form of well, a new genre, as it were. So an artist like Gainsborough was learning very much from the Dutch context, and also specifically Gainsborough was also inspired by the French context too. So as well as the sort of Dutch sort of realist landscape painting, also the French Rococo, which really kind of gives his style a very kind of lyrical and poetic approach to landscape. And it's worth pointing out that his landscape painting was very much constructed from his imagination. He was never really concerned with topographical landscape painting. So again, that's worth bearing in mind, that it's a construction through his imagination, and the way he puts a landscape together. It can be based on specific locations, but actually he's developed a theme somewhat. It's worth pointing out at this point that he's very much a precursor of later Romantic artists, in particular John Constable. Constable was a small child when Gainsborough died, and the influence over Constable is quite profound. And I think there's a number of quotes. I mean, I'll just give you a sense of this admiration that Constable had in his time to the sort of poetic sensibility of Gainsborough's paintings, where Constable said, and I quote now, "On looking at them, we find tears in our eyes and know not what brings them." So Constable recognized this sort of poetic quality, even though Constable himself is much more known for his very sort of direct and sort of atmospheric approaches to landscape. But he saw in Constable's work very much the basis of that he would explore in his work. I think in terms of going back to Gainsborough specifically, I think what's interesting is that you see in his paintings that I think for me really stands out, and it is this sort of synthesis of humanity and nature, where he sort of blends the two. And this is true. This is certainly true in his landscapes, but also in his portraits as well. So he's a very well known portrait painter as well. But landscape is never far away. He wanted to develop his landscape painting further, but portraits were how he made a living. So it's interesting that landscape kept developing and sort of found its way as a sort of intrinsic part into his portraits, so that you have figures that are sort of merging with the landscape, which is something I think is for me really, really interesting about his work. And it kind of reminds me, in a sense, some of the subjects we're talking about today, and that this sense that perhaps in recent times we've lost, or there's a disconnect between landscape and nature that you very much see in the work of Thomas Gainsborough 300 years ago. Whether he felt that the disconnect was beginning to happen or not, I'm not entirely sure. But for me, looking at it now, it reminds me of that connectedness. So he was very technically proficient, experimental, and the painting, I think if we bring up the slide now, I want to talk about really to sort of look in a bit more detail about this relationship between humanity and nature, is Cornard Wood. So I don't know if that can come up on the screen in a moment, but Cornard Wood is a painting that Thomas Gainsborough made in 1748. He was still a young man. He'd already, by this time, he had finished his apprenticeship in London with a number of artists, but he produces this painting when he is only 20. And some of the things I briefly touched on, the Dutch tradition and the French tradition can be seen in this painting. It's relatively big for the period, 122 centimeters by 155, and it's a young artist, and he'd studied and copied the Dutch masters, and in fact this painting relates quite closely to one by the Dutch artist Ruysdael. So that's what he was thinking about, and Gainsborough would have seen Dutch paintings in collections throughout the region of East Anglia, and indeed in London. Cornard Wood has this sort of rather sort of dreamy quality that does set it apart from the sort of Dutch landscapes that were inspiring him. And what I was saying about how it's not a topographical representation. So Cornard Wood, it is a place. It's on the outskirts of Sudbury, the town where I am, where Gainsborough's house is, and it's you can make out certain topographical features in the center of the painting. You may, on the slide, just be able to see a church, St Mary's Great. So there are topographical features that one can decipher in the painting. But I think in a sense, what the painting is saying, and is pertinent for the discussion today, is that what it's representing in terms of the activities going on in the location is that in Gainsborough's time, Cornard Wood was common land, that is not private property, and the villagers had ancient rights to gather wood, to graze animals. They could dig for marl, for manure and sand, for building materials, and they could just go there for strolls and to spend time. So it was free and open to everybody. And in Gainsborough's painting, you can see these activities going on. Again, the detail probably just about discernible in terms of people resting, people collecting firewood, and those type of things. So we know this painting was painted in 1748, and the ideas behind it. He wrote in a letter that there was very little idea of composition when he painted it, but he said about just the touch and closeness of nature is what he felt inspired him. So I think that's a rather nice kind of metaphor to his approach to this painting. That again, it's setting a scene, but it's the touch and closeness to nature that he wanted to acknowledge. So, I mean, the political context which I've touched on, of it being common land. I mean, just to sort of reflect for a few minutes. This is a huge subject, so forgive me for generalising a little bit. But the political context of the 18th century and the privatisation of land. So this painting speaks very much of that, in a sense that during Gainsborough's lifetime, the process of privatisation of land in England was called the enclosures, and in a very, very short period, land became private property, which we no need to remind ourselves what that also meant for the colonial enterprise. But what Gainsborough was representing here is the effects in England, and what was to be lost in terms of access to land, and this sort of sense of dislocating people and their sort of social and cultural bonds to land, and to remove the spiritual connection and a spirit of place that existed in these pre-colonial times, is bound up in this painting and what it represents, and would change completely within his lifetime, pretty much. Obviously, that's a huge subject to unpick. Maybe there'll be a little bit of time to talk a bit more about that. I think I'll leave it there for Cornard Wood as an example of Gainsborough's landscape painting, and then just to talk a little bit about the program that we're developing at Gainsborough's house. So art and landscape. The sense here that we have the ability to represent sort of historic practice, but we very much want to link that with contemporary practice, and through art we want to explore really all kind of manifestations of aspects about land, the environment, land use, natural resources, art and farming, land management, and indeed connectedness to nature that I've mentioned before. So this idea of the programming, I mean, it aligns very nicely with Johnny and the team and their ideas around developing program. In that we want to, it's not just painting. Painting will be important to us here, as obviously the historic context is painting, but we really want to explore more fully how art and how artists are engaging in the landscape. How they're thinking about environmental issues, ecology, natural resources, and all of these topics that we're sort of trying to deal with here. Certainly in terms of painting, obviously, we're interested in developing residencies and artists who might well respond to the historic context, and indeed respond specifically to Gainsborough. I've just given you one example of his paintings today, but there's a lot that we want to think about, and perhaps hasn't been addressed more fully in the historic context either. So the curatorial approach will hopefully draw on fresh perspectives of landscape, and really kind of shift our understanding of what that's about in contemporary times. And obviously, art and landscape has a very, very long tradition. So I'm always fascinated how it within the contemporary it seems to have become so urgent. I would say largely through the environmental crisis, but it's interesting how we've reached that point where landscape and representing an artist and an institution that's something that's very natural to us, that has become such a major part of contemporary practice. Well, I think I'll leave it there. I think I've touched on those three aspects I wanted to talk about today.
Thank you. No, it's amazing, and thinking about Gainsborough's Cornard Wood in such a sort of, I guess in the social context, and thinking of it as a political painting is not something that I've really considered before. It's very interesting. We've had a question from the audience. We're going to bring in some of the artists who are part of the show here in London. And Calvin, I know you had some questions to put to them. But before we do, I'd just like to ask you on behalf of an audience member, what do you think, you've got this contemporary art program now at Gainsborough's House, which, by the way, is an absolutely fantastic museum. It's beautifully curated, and I encourage everyone to go if you can make it to East Anglia. But what do you feel is Gainsborough's legacy today in terms of contemporary art? Do you think he still has something to say, not just in terms of his work, but is he still inspiring the art that's being created, and what is his legacy now?
I think that's the mission, basically. So I'm relatively new here, but I think for me, what's interesting about Thomas Gainsborough, there are many things, but I think it's been more firmly established, the connection between some of his contemporaries, such as, slightly later contemporary John Constable, about how artists today might look at historic practice and be inspired or feel that's an interesting context. I think for Thomas Gainsborough, I think there's work to do to look at someone who pretty much invented this idea of landscape painting in the UK. There were a number of artists, but he's certainly prominent amongst them. So an artist as a pioneer is trying things, experimenting with things, and trying to set a scene where he could practice this himself as an artist, purely looking at landscape. He had this dual practice of creating portraits, which he was extremely good at, but that was the sort of financial security. But actually, wherever possible, he would experiment and he would innovate in terms of his landscape painting. And I think that's something I want to bring to the fore now. And I've sort of touched on some of these things today about this sort of poetic response to landscape, that actually it's a response of the imagination as much as sort of topographical. I mean, he was an image maker, so obviously that's a very specific type of practice in the current context, but you get this sense that, and I think we've touched on this already, that what do you feel when you look at these paintings as much as what do you understand about them? And I think that's something that the painting like Cornard Wood, I think if you stand in front of it, this idea of the forest is a wonderful kind of metaphor that you see. You feel you're amongst the trees. You feel like you're amongst the environment there in a way that I hope Thomas Gainsborough would have liked and would have wanted. I should also say that Cornard Wood is a relatively recent name for the painting. In fact, it's believed that John Constable came up with the name because he was determined to find the location. And I said for Gainsborough, the location was probably not as important as it was for this next generation. John Constable's well known for painting in the landscape, as well as within the studio. But for Constable, or in Constable's time, it was referred to as Gainsborough's forest. And again, the Rysdale painting that had inspired Gainsborough was called The Forest. So I think, again, it's a much more sort of poetic response about feeling as much as it is about a specific place.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Well, now I would like to bring in three of the artists who have been involved in the Messham's Landscape Painting show here in London and online. First, Cara Campbell, I'd like to introduce, who's a British artist who works in egg tempera on fresco, which is a fascinating medium, giving her work a very sort of an extraordinary matte texture. And she works largely depicting weeds as much as any other features within the landscape, which she describes as the foot soldiers of nature. So welcome, Cara. Jean Huang as well, another artist in our show. Jean's a Canadian in origin, but living in London. And Jean's work brings her practice out into nature, responding directly and using the natural environment to create the work. And lastly, Michael Rainsford, an artist based in the west of Ireland, although he's lived in the UK for many years. And Michael's work, again, takes very direct reference to the landscape, using pigments and references to specific details that he observes to create his extraordinary abstract work. So welcome all three of you, and thank you for joining us. And I'll hand over to you again, Calvin, and you can, ask.
Thanks, Will. Yes. So welcome. I've got a number of questions, and they're not going to be too tricksy, so don't worry, because I know you've not heard my questions before. So they're going to be as a gentle kind of provocation into your practices. So I'm going to start with Jean, if that's okay. And Jean, you can hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you. Thank you.
Right. Well, it's really nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
So I was just talking a moment ago about Thomas Gainsborough, and that his was largely a studio practice. We know he sketched in the landscape, but his paintings were very much done in the studio. So I'm interested in how you work often outdoors. So I think, to start us off, if you can talk through your practice of how you work outside of a studio space.
Sure. So each of my paintings begin on a hike. So I'll bring a piece of large unstretched canvas with me and go hiking into the wilderness. And along the way, whatever catches my eye, whether it's like an interesting boulder, I'll wrap the piece around it and paint by doing frottage, or I'll respond to the weather conditions. So one particular piece, there was a large flood, so I left the canvas out into the water and then just let the flood water stain the canvas. And then another big part of the process is incorporating my own body into it. So it's almost like I hike with the painting and I live on the painting in a way. So for example, if I get tired of hiking, I'll like sit on the canvas and rest on it. I'll trace how I sat on the piece. So it's a lot about hiking with the piece, and then it's like my companion.
Thank you. I love the idea of your sort of body being part of this process, and how that almost becomes joy into the environment where you've decided to work. Okay, I've got a related question. I'm going to move on to Michael now. Michael, I can't see you at the moment. Actually, no, I can see you now. Can you hear me okay?
Can hear you, yeah.
Great. Well, it's nice to meet you too.
Yep.
And so kind of expanding this idea of working out of doors, can you tell us something about your response to place in relation to where you've worked and how that shapes your work? Because I think the particular locations you've been based have kind of played an important part in your practice.
They have, yes. I mean, I'm very fortunate that I've always been able to live with good access to the natural environment. The work that I've been doing, I call it the language of place. It's a little bit where I try to allow the place itself to speak through me. So rather than going out into the landscape with a lot of stuff, I go out there with just my hands. And it's very much about that process of walking, of slowing down, of getting thoughts out of my mind. And that leads to a kind of a listening and a more alert response to the place that I'm in. And when I'm in that state, then I can kind of notice things. I notice things in the landscape. It might be the shapes of gorse, or it might be the way bracken leaves cross over, or the way the wind moves the rushes. Little things like that you don't normally notice unless you slow down and pay attention. And then from there, I move towards actually doing things with whatever I can find. So it might be using the earth typically, maybe marking a stone with earth. And I kind of make marks that are noticeable. It's about noticing, but I'm trying to make the noticing more noticeable, so that marks are organized in a way that is a human touch, making the minimal human intervention, if you like. And that kind of sensory engagement really is important to me, because I think it's good psychologically. It's an important thing. And then, having made those marks, I have a kind of connection to that place. And that connection then, and it's interesting talking about ephemerality in art earlier on, those pieces are left to wash away in the rain. If it's soil or if it's sticks, they blow away, or berry stains. And I think I then take some of that earth back to the studio, and then make not an exact replica, but I use those marks again to almost remind myself of what was outside and bring it inside. And then that becomes the work. That becomes, for me, the language of place. The work's very simple. It's very direct. With just my hands, I can only make very simple marks. It's usually a dot, or it might be a dash, which is a pulled dot of earth. So you get a kind of a pattern emerging, like herringbone or a sequence of dots. And that almost has a language-like quality. So the way I see it is really that I'm bringing the outside in, and trying to, I suppose, really celebrate the places that I've been to. But again, allowing them to speak.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Okay.
So we'll move on to Cara now. Cara, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, it's really nice to meet you. So I mean, this sort of related question, and I guess I'd like us to hear something about how your work explores and sort of centers us, humans, that is, as part of nature. And if you can tell us a little bit about your practice and how you think that connectedness is emerging.
Well, I suppose it could, for me, it happens incidentally, in that I actually live by a common, like 300-acre common. So hopefully I'm like Gainsborough. But I go, that's where I sort of found the plants. And initially it was a thing of convenience, that I could, rather than try and paint them in situ, because the materials that I usually use are lime, and I prefer to use those sort of natural historic materials. So I did try initially to do it in plein air, but it was not nice, and I'm a wuss. So I bring them back and then just picking them stem by stem and painting them one by one, without much of a thought about arrangement, although I'm trying to do that a bit more. But I can, it's a very close observation. So I don't draw anything before, I don't plan it, and it's like drawing what I see with colour. And as I'm doing it, I'm just sort of awed and inspired by the delicacy and the detail of what I'm doing. And so I hope that as I'm doing that, I'm sort of sharing what I can see with my audience and kind of drawing them in the same way. That's, to me, I find it quite sort of mesmerizing, and also, I suppose, and increasingly moving in terms of what we were saying in the context of the climate crisis. It just seems sort of, yes, tragic and exquisite at the same time.
Okay. I like the sense we're moving from inside to outside, and we'll keep coming back between the two. But we'll go back to Jean, if we may. And I like this sense of of collaboration with nature. But I specifically wanted to ask you about the Northwest Coast, because I understand that that's where you spent your formative years. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm originally from the middle of Canada, so on the prairies, and then for the past 5 years, I lived on Vancouver. So yeah, on the coast.
So yeah, so I'm interested in how your approach is coming from a Northwest Coast context. Has that shaped your program? Has that how does that manifest itself in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just being surrounded by nature and so much wilderness on the coast, the forests are incredibly old, and they're just a walk away from the city, and the ocean's right there, and the mountains are a drive away as well. It definitely influenced the way I wanted to collaborate with nature because it was always in my backyard. And then going back to acknowledging the land. Canada is also unceded land. And so always seeing the Indigenous people appreciate the land and work with it there, that definitely inspired me to not just gaze upon the landscape, but see it as a living entity and work with it.
No, thank you. Thank you. So a similar question to Michael. Michael, it seems to me that your response is very much within the English tradition and a sense of English landscape. If that's correct, could we explore that a little bit about is it a direct response to the English context, or is it more broad?
I think it's put it within the English-Irish context, if you like. That kind of that's where the heritage would come from. The piece that I have there was called Cagey Fields. They're fields in North Mayo that were discovered under the bog about 6,000 years ago. And what was fascinating about them is that the man that found them, Patrick Caulfield, who's a local teacher, he discovered that there was rocks under the bog that had a pattern, and that pattern ended up being field patterns. So 6,000 years ago, there were field patterns that you would recognize today. So there's that sense of continuity of people working with the land, early farmers, Stone Age farmers, going right through till very much the contemporary times, and it's only starting to change quickly now. So I think there's that kind of sense of history that's always important when you're out in the landscape. There people have been there before. There's no, if it's the bog or the moorland, it's not natural in the sense that it's been managed by people for many years. So that relationship has been there, and I think we're getting to a point where we recognise that maybe that relationship's gone out of kilter. Mm-hmm. So I think that's kind of at the back of my head a lot of the time when I'm outside.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Cara, coming back to you and this sort of sense about out of doors and indoors, and indeed macro and micro. We can go to the sort of micro with your work and this sort of meticulous study of nature. So you focus in very, very closely. Want to talk us through, how that works?
Oh. Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by your question, but apart from the obvious, which is, what I was saying about just having it in front of me, and that's what I love, and the sort of feeling of discovery and noticing, I suppose, just super focused, and sometimes to facilitate that, I actually, like with the ferns, and this is a technical detail that maybe you're not so much interested in, but I would pick those and they'd be floppy, in a minute. So I actually, now I plant them in pots so I can bring them into the studio to do that. So it's getting more and more of it sort of premeditated, but once it's there in front of me, then it is just quite absorbing, and I can kind of let myself fall into it. Does that answer your question?
It does. I'll try and rephrase the question a little bit to help. I think it's the sense that your focus on particular plant life How does that relate to broader concerns? I guess that's my question.
Well, again, that's an ambiguous question. I think I suppose there's two elements of answering that. One of which is the plants that I choose, and the dandelion was actually the first one that I really noticed, and from childhood, and they're very ubiquitous, and everyone hates them, or gardeners hate them, but the dark background that I sort of developed was partly to show off the delicacy of that, and I think they are particularly a strong symbol of delicacy, but also survival. And I've actually forgotten the other part of what I was going to say.
No, that's okay. That really helps. Thank you. And we're going to move back to Jean, and I want to talk a little bit about seasonality. So I think there is perhaps this sense, particularly in metropolitan areas, that you can lose sight of seasonality. So I just wanted to maybe hear that if that affects your work.
Yeah, seasonality is a big part of my work because I see it kind of like in a friendship type of way. So I often return to the same site over different seasons to see how the place has changed. And then also I feel like seasonality is more of a personal metaphor as well. Like when I go and see a place in the autumn and I see the leaves falling and the trees being bare, it usually reflects my inner landscape. So I feel like seasonality is both like observing the landscape as it is, but also seeing how like my inner seasons are changing as well.
Thank you. And Michael, a similar question to you. I guess you can answer seasonality too, but the sort of environmental or atmosphere and weather, as much as land, how do these factors affect your work?
Well, they can affect my work. I suppose you can get 4 seasons in a day in the west of Ireland. So it's in terms of what you can actually do, as well as what you can actually find. So depending on the weather, you will have the landscape in a certain way. You'll have berries at certain times of the year. That might be something that comes to mind that calls attention, and you might use berries to make marks. Not so much nowadays, but we used to get snow, and snow was something that could be used. So I think in terms of the wider environmental concerns, seasonality is something that is an issue that I think as artists, particularly artists who are working out in the landscape, are beginning to notice. I mean, I'm actually sitting here on November the 11th and the sun is baking outside. I could actually be sitting outside on a deck chair. And that's a concern, really. It doesn't feel right. So yeah.
Okay. And Cara, back to you.
Yes.
I read a comment you made about your work. I think you said that it was phrase a spiritual communion, which really struck me quite profoundly. I wonder whether you could explore this theme about how you think your work and how your practice converses with nature.
Well, I suppose I sort of get drawn into what I'm looking at, but I do think it's reflecting on it as I'm painting. I think it's a human need to see green things and flowers and be and touching the soil and those sort of connecting things. And I think it's a sort of, I suppose I think in my description almost spiritual, because it's sort of, you hesitate to say it's a full-on soulful experience, but actually I think it is. And I think it's, yeah, so it's sort of very rewarding and calming to paint it, but I also think, you know, as just a human being, it's deeply nourishing and calming and lovely. And I suppose that's also part of the concern, is that the further we get away from it, you know, the more the Anthropocene sort of rapacious devouring of the earth and its resources, the less there is of us to respond to. So it's becoming a sort of vicious circle, like, you know, like global warming. It's going to go exponentially. The further we are removed from it, the less we appreciate it, and it's a sort of forgotten connection.
No, thank you. Jean, I don't know whether you want to add anything to that, in terms of the situation we find ourselves in, and how much you feel your work is responding to the crisis.
Yeah, definitely. The climate crisis is always on my mind whenever I'm creating the work, because I'm looking at the landscapes and I'm trying, when I paint out there, I also try to research what is actually happening in those landscapes. So a recent work, I went out to the Seven Sisters Cliffs, which is on the English coast, and I learned that the cliffs are slowly, actually quite quickly eroding with sea level rise and extreme weather events. So after learning that, I find that my process ends up mimicking the natural processes that happen in the landscape. So with the erosion, I guess it's kind of subconscious, but I end up like crumbling chalk onto the piece. So the painting kind of develops in the same way that the landscape is. And then another large part of my work is creating a sort of archive of these landscapes that will eventually change, or also disappear over time with climate change. So it's kind of like a snapshot of my experience of this place in this moment in time, before it changes, I guess.
Thank you. And coming back to Michael, I guess the same question about the crisis. How much is the crisis affecting your practice, or has it begun to affect your practice?
I think in my practice, I suppose it's this focus on having that physical engagement with place. I think it's a crisis psychologically. I think in terms of mental health and well-being, I think people have become divorced from the land. I think the human body was kind of designed to work with the land a large extent, and I think modern technologies have made that separation much greater. So I do think there's an element where being able to reconnect in a physical way is important for us. And that doesn't have to be as an artist. It means, you know, you can be a gardener, you can be whatever, but to actually have some physical engagement with the earth, I think is very important. People do all sorts of things. They go outside and they go hang gliding, or they go all sorts of things. But sometimes it needs to be about getting your hands into the earth. And I think that's good for the body and it's good for the mind. It's a bit about getting outside of yourself. So that's probably where I'm coming from.
Thank you. And Cora, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, actually, it's put me in mind of Buddhism and lots of philosophies and religion, and now married to science, they're finding that there's all sorts of microbes in soil that sort of help feed us. And if we're made up of lots of millions of tiny bacteria, which are so sort of I suppose the concept of what's without is within, and actually, we're not separate, and our culture and our civilization has increasingly encouraged us to think of ourselves as remote and at the top of some hierarchy. And yes, and we're obviously not. And yeah, and I suppose the sort of dark bit of me thinks, actually, wouldn't it be wonderful for nature if the humans finally did themselves in, and we're just a brief speck of time in a vast continuum.
No, thank you. I might introduce Wilf. I don't know if we have questions coming in or whether you want to add any further questions. We've sort of gone through most of the questions I was going to ask our panel.
Yeah, I think unfortunately I'm not sure we have a great deal of time to introduce too many other questions. There are some questions coming in from the audience. Just see if there's one perhaps we could ask the group. Someone has asked, how do you make sure your presence is not impacting the landscape or encouraging more visitors to a beautiful location? I think that's quite an interesting point. Perhaps I could just put that to the three of you and get your take.
So for me, I really try to adopt the leave no trace hiking principle. So when I go out to paint, I'll really study the landscape to ensure I'm not collaborating with a very fragile environment. So if it's like lichen, I'm not going to go and put my canvas over it and trace over it. And I bring drop cloths along to ensure that my paint doesn't run off into the land. But I would say that I like to encourage people to go out into the landscape because I feel like when you're out there and the more people who go out there and do it in a careful and respectful manner, then they become more connected to it. And when you become connected to it, then you'll feel more a greater sense to care and protect the landscapes.
Thank you. Michael, do you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd agree with what Jean said. I think it is about respect. The minimal impact. I mean, I tend to go out there with just a pair of hands, and I might come back with a tiny bit of soil. So there's not much going on there. And then I'm not really advertising where I go. It's a big. The West of Ireland's a big area, so I don't think there's going to be many tourists following me in that regard. But I do think it's important for people to make that connection with the natural world, because that way you respect it, that way you care for it, and you love it, and you pass that on to your children. So I think that's important.
Mm. And Cara, yours is a more observational practice, but do you have any thoughts as well on the impact that your work might have on the physical environment?
Well, I suppose a little bit, but I think that my worst crime is probably in my pigments, because some of them are not natural. Everything else I use could kind of crumble back, and if I think of a flower, it's like collateral damage to a primrose. If I pick one, I don't think, I hope that I'm doing more to kind of honor it and advertise it as a thing to be respected than I am, doing the damage to the individual thing. And also I think with weeds, it's and like moss, so there's moss everywhere. I've seen in my local town there's a shop that's been empty, and inside it's obviously very damp, so the whole of the front of the window display is now moss, and you can see it in pavements and bursting through. So I sort of think, on balance, I hope that I draw people's attention to it more and sympathetically than I damage anything.
Interesting. Yeah, and I liked what you said as well, Jean, about your work being a sort of collaboration with nature, and I can almost see that in all three of you as well. Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to wrap up there because we have run over. But I'd just like to thank everyone so much again for joining us for this symposium, and to all our speakers for their contributions. It's been really fascinating, and I've certainly benefited from it, and I hope everyone's learned something. I'll be going back to your work, Cara, Jean, and Michael, and looking at it in a different context now. And I encourage everyone, please, to look at our website, the Messams website, to look at the landscape exhibition, both in person and online. And we're also having a further incarnation of this show, an expanded incarnation in the Tithe Barn that Johnny was talking about in Wiltshire, and that's opening in January. So please do come along and check out that show. And if you'd like to hear more of these curated conversations about art and about the environment and other topics, then please do hit the subscribe button, which is in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. So yes, thank you everyone once again, and I hope you have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Brad. Thank you, Rob.
Bye-bye.